Welcome to Everything PC, episode 3 of season 2. My name is Duncan McLeod, editor of Tech Central. I'm joined by my collaborator in this venture, Gerhard Pretorius. Gerhard, good to see you again.
Yes.
Gerhard works at Computers Only. I think I neglected to say that in last week's episode.
Yes.
But
that's fine.
Apologies.
It's all good, no worries.
Welcome to the show. We are, as is becoming customary, going to look at some old tech before we talk about all the new stuff. So, what have we got here today? Let's have a quick squiz at all of this. Let me close my machine. Gerhard, you brought this in this morning.
The super and advanced Pentium 2.
Pentium 2, which actually comes out of its slot.
It's a socketed.
Let me hand it to you because
it's a socketed chip.
Socket chip.
Yes, well,
you don't see those very often.
Basically, socket when this thing allows it to come free from the fan header.
I think there we go. Okay.
So there you can see the nice advertisement for Pentium with a shiny reflective part of the actual chip design inside and so forth. This is the version that has both in it, so it has a MMX chip in it as well.
That's the mass processor.
Yep. So that is now all integrated. So when you actually open this whole thing, you'll see there's two chips in here. They actually act as the CPU in stations. But yeah, chips were mostly traditional where we had the normal BGA basically BGA socket where it has the needles and so forth that you put in and so forth. Then Intel moved to this socketed form because the CPU was not just one chip. It was actually two chips that they've actually early days of chiplet. So that we have got two chips on here, and then it was just easier to sell it as a socketed chip that you can just stock in. And from Pentium 2, we made Pentium 3, and then basically since then, we went back to the more traditional way. We now understand it, but a lot of kids and a lot of people don't actually know that they sold CPUs in this type of format.
I'd forgotten they did that, actually.
Yeah, it's one of those, the Pentiums were...
So quick question for you then. What is this chip over here that says Intel on it?
Well, that's the actual... That would be technically the North Bridge. So there will be the North Bridge and then the South Bridge.
Right.
So the South Bridge normally handles the interfaces over here. Mm-hmm. And then the actual North Bridge handles all the memory and all that stuff. Because most of the stuff which we take for granted for now with most modern day CPUs, all of your memory controllers and I/O and all those things are actually now integrated into the actual CPU. Whereas in the old days, that was done by another chip. That's why you had more chips than you could count and so forth. And then now, luckily now, especially with the newer stuff, if you open it, it's all consolidated into one chip now. So Intel...
what year was this, roughly?
That should be 96, 97, I think.
Right, so running Windows 95, that would have been running.
Yeah, you can actually see this actually has a very nice cutout of the back of the board where you can actually see all the traces. Most of this is now covered up and so forth with masking and shielding and so forth. That's why all the boards are more vulnerable because you can actually feel the actual gold layering and gold circuitry that they've gone through. Because this is probably... let me see if I can count this correctly. This is probably a 1, 2, 3, 4, probably a 4-layer PCB, I think, in this.
It's quite heavy, actually.
Yeah, no, it's especially now with the RAM, the VRM, and this is pretty historic. This is type of VRM that you'll see in a power supply now. Right. It actually has heat sinks bolted to it like this. So this is...
And what connectors does it have around the sides? It's,
USB.
Serial ports. And
we've got USB 1. We've got 2 keyboard and mouse inputs there.
PS2
keys, yep. And then we've got parallel and then 2 COM ports.
COM ports, amazing.
Yeah. No, that's when they still had mices and interfaces worked with COM ports. So that's why they gave you 2 COMs, because some of the mices actually worked if you had your trackball mouse or advanced gaming mouse. That some of them
was
were
before
still
Bluetooth.
Zero. Oh yes, no, very much before Bluetooth. So this is
all cabled
this
up.
This is the age when when this board came out. I think the max amount of RAM was 256 meg, and then they go.
Then you were really rocking it if you had that much.
Because this is early day of PC RAM and so forth. So yes, 64 megs.
64 megs of RAM.
There we go, 64 megs. Now you can buy a stick like this with DDR4. It's 32 gigs now. When DDR5 comes out, we'll probably have close to 64 gigs in one of these sticks.
Incredible. Incredible. But this was running Windows 95, very, very old.
Oh, yes. No, this is Windows 95, Windows NT, all that type of jazz.
Yeah.
Because again, it's Pentium 2. So it is Pentium 2 was replaced quite quickly with Pentium 3 in like 2000s.
Right. Let me see how good my PC building skills are.
Well, this is also very odd because most people will know like DDR. Most DDR has only one cutout. This actually has two cutouts in it. So this tells you how old this is. Like we're getting to a point where it's like DDR is still getting its foot into the market.
Amazing. Yes. And these plug-in CPUs didn't stay on the market for very long, did they?
No. Now that got replaced really quickly when we started to integrate more and more of L2 cache and all that type of jazz.
Why did they do this?
Well, it's mainly because it was just chiplet. Yeah, the chips were too big because that's still
to fit on the board.
It's like literally the chip in there is like commonly used, and again, it was quite expensive because it was like cutting edge technology back then.
This isn't the chip. This is just a
no.
picture.
That's just like a marketing thing where it's like just to show you. Oh, okay. In the chip is much smaller than that in there, but that's I think what node were they on that? That would be probably close to. I think they were like 64 nanometer.
Or higher.
Yeah.
This is the old tech where they hadn't reached the point where the wavelengths would
be so small that you can't see it.
Can't see anymore. So this is all colorful because this isn't the actual chip.
Yes. No.
But presumably that's what the chip looks like in light inside.
Yeah. No. When you actually cut the chip off or slice a bit of it off, and you can actually look at it underneath the microscope, and then it will look like that.
I'm guessing Intel hasn't made it easy to open this thing up.
It's not too difficult. This fan actually clips off. Then I think you just press here. It clips off. There's the heatsink.
Right. Let's show that to the camera.
Then there's the actual heatsink. That's how small it is. The other shocking part, if I show this side, this chip needs 2 volts to go through it. If you do that with a current chip, it will literally die instantly. Because most chips, like 1.4 volts is like the max. Like most DDR RAM, again, more efficient than all the things. DDR5 is 1.1 volt is the JEDEC standard. Yeah, I think the RAM on that is pushing also close to 2 volts and 1.9 volts and so forth in the actual RAM. So this is also shocking how much voltage you need to push through this thick ass chip that's so dense. Again,
sure, NVIDIA didn't invent that.
No. Well, NVIDIA started to invent making proper south bridges though. That's where they pioneered later on. But I think it's basically these 4 screws come out here. At some point, when we've got another show and so forth, we'll strip this apart and actually people can see how it looks inside as well. Because it's not, you can probably Google it and there's some YouTube videos that will have like old show stuff where they'll have these working and you can see it and so forth. Because there's still, if you look at that, Duncan, that also looks a bit different from your normal power connector. That's just a normal 20 pin, not a 24 pin. And the other funny thing is that when you look at the board properly, you'll see there's no CPU power as well. There is only the 20 pin that goes in. Normally, you'll see if you're now building a PC, you'll see there's like a 8 pin or 4 pin power that goes there dedicated to the CPU, and then you'll have a 24 pin here now for the motherboard. So that's even before that even.
Museum piece.
Yes, no, this is now proper museum.
And it's only 25 years old.
Yes, but only.
Right, it should run this operating system quite well.
Yes.
Kids, if you're younger than 30, you probably have never touched one of these.
Yes.
This is a floppy disk, 5.25 inch floppy disk. In South Africa, we called the smaller version of this the 3.5 inch floppy disk a stiffy disk.
Yes.
Which apparently no one else in the world does.
Yes,
just us calls them stiffy disks. They're also called floppy disks, even though they are stiff. I kind of like it.
Well, yeah, this is
really floppy.
It's a floppy disk, and then you'll get the other ones which are hard.
So this was a high density disk format.
Yeah.
So the standard of these, certainly when I was a kid, was 360 kilobytes of storage on one of these, and that was actually an improvement because I think the previous generation was 180 kilobytes.
Yes.
And before that, there were even bigger versions of this that were 8 inches in size that stored even less. Now this was a high density disk. This was cool stuff.
State of the art technology.
Early 1990s or late 1980s, and this was a high density disk that was capable of storing an entire 1.2 megabytes. Amazing. And how many disks are over there? I think it's about 9. This is to install Windows 3.1. I think the last two one or two disks are printer drivers.
And then you were hoping that none of them were faulty.
Yes, indeed.
Because if one was faulty, you were screwed.
Well, I installed these disks many times actually, and they never failed on me. So good quality product that Microsoft produced here. It might still work today. I don't know. I'm sure that
if you kept it away from magnets and so forth, it should still work.
I'm sure there's been some degradation.
That's the advantage of making old stuff. They were crudely made, but they had to make them properly because you didn't want to go and make it over and over and over again.
Yeah. So if you're of a certain age, you'll remember putting these in your computer, turning the little switch, listening to the drive fire up. Exactly. And you go and make a cup of coffee while it copies everything from here onto the puny little hard drive that you had in your computer. And installing Windows was a very slow and painful process back then. But you've got Windows 95 on so-called stiffy disks, which we'll show you in our next episode. But good old days. This was 1992, if I remember correctly. This OS came out.
Yes, that should be the simple days.
This was the predecessor to Windows 95. There we go. The date is on it. 1992. Copyright Microsoft Corporation. US patent number. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Ancient history.
Oh.
Ancient history. Right. Let me open my ultra-modern laptop and let's dive into stuff that's a little more recent.
Yes.
And I'm a bit reluctant to talk tech news on the show because we do publish about three and a half weeks after we actually record these. But there was some interesting news this morning, which I actually wanted to just chat to you about, since we've been talking about NVIDIA a lot in this podcast and in our previous show, season 1. And that's that EVGA, which is a big US manufacturer of graphics cards, has announced that they are
no more graphics for you.
No longer going to make graphics cards. Yet this was 80% of their business.
Yeah, no, this is shocking.
And they're pointing a big finger at NVIDIA.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunately NVIDIA has a trend. That's the problem. NVIDIA's putting them in a position where nobody likes them, and that's a bad strategy in the long term. I think they might wither it if they do it like the Apple way, where they can beat themselves in a position where they cannot die, basically. But that's a very risky move to... Yeah. It's actually quite shocking that someone would go this public, because the problem is NVIDIA never forgets. I know even Linus said that once. I think if you look at Linus's videos and so forth, NVIDIA will... This
is Linus Torvalds.
No. This is Linus from Linus Tech.
Linus Tech Tips. Okay.
Tech Tips and so forth.
Right.
Like...
Oopsie.
Nah, all good.
Just gonna put this clunker over
NVIDIA is very... They can become... That's the problem with NVIDIA. They can be so good but so bad at the same time with certain things.
Yes.
So we'll check and see how this affects the other partners as well, because that's what I'm really interested to see, how like Gigabyte, MSI, and Asus would respond to this and so forth. I presume they're kind of happy because that means one less competitor for America, because EVGA's market is predominantly America, like huge market.
I'm a big fan of their cards. I own 2 of their graphics cards.
They made decent cards. They were a very proud company, and the CEO was very decent and so forth. I think from my point of view, the feeling I got is NVIDIA pushed, because EVGA was what Sapphire is to AMD. So Sapphire to AMD is, Sapphire makes all the Fire Pro cards. So all the high-end like Pro cards and the server cards and all those things, majority of that's made by Sapphire. Now EVGA did that. Now I heard rumblings that there was things happening in the back end where NVIDIA actually kind of like, yes, EVGA still made, because most of the Quadro cards and so forth were also made by EVGA. They were their equivalent to Sapphire. So they made all the Pro cards and all the server cards and all those things. Then NVIDIA, I presume, either got greedy or just like saying, we don't need to use them. We'll rather do that internally to save costs or something like that. So they slightly but surely kicked them off, which I think that's probably where it started. And that's why this is not like a new thing. I think this is a EVGA where NVIDIA abused and abused and abused, and then eventually...
On what margin?
Not just margin, just in general, everything. Like how they dealt with them.
Right.
They just didn't... Arrogant, but it's also not helping them. And it's like, here's this thing, just do it this way, just do it our way.
Right.
It's like, but this is EVGA. These guys know what they're doing. It's like, it's not the first time they're making a graphics card or something like that. Come on, guys, they made your professional cards for you and mass-produced it for you. So it's like, it's a lot of factors, I think, that played into it. But the fact that EVGA went and said, we're canceling it and we're not doing GPUs at all. And yeah, that's so pity. That just really starts to show NVIDIA's actual envious side coming through quite aggressively now.
Why? I mean, if they are treating their channel, their OEM partners very well, which this EVGA announcement would seem to suggest.
Yes.
Why does NVIDIA even work with OEM partners? Why doesn't it just make its own graphics cards and sell them?
Well,
directly?
they do. That's the problem. This is why most of
The
the guys
Founders
like
Edition.
us, we kind of predicted this from 2012.
Yeah.
Even we internally at our store, we looked at it and saying, the fact that they're making their own cards, this is starting to be scary. And then they kind of reassured us saying, no, they're only going to do this. And then when the 20 series came out, then it's like, no, we're going to make the same cards as you guys. And it's like, that's kind of unfair, because how is all these other board partners supposed to compete with the actual manufacturer of the chip? They don't have the same, it's a massive advantage, because NVIDIA can start with the R&D much earlier. They make the reference spec board. So the advantage the board partners had is, for a long time, NVIDIA's reference spec was trash. Like, and it was garbage tier quality. That's why it was not difficult to be better than NVIDIA's, because NVIDIA's reference design was trash. So that's why you saw not a lot of Chinese companies try and step in, and even if they do, it was poor quality and crap. Because shockingly, that's where it's a weird disconnect between the two, because you had AMD on the one side where their reference design is better than some of the board partners' normal design and cheaper cards. So AMD would have a reference design, and that's like, this is what we would recommend you do. You can go cheaper than that because it was already massively overbuilt from AMD side. Now, NVIDIA started doing that with the 20 series, where NVIDIA's reference designs were actually decent enough. That's why you saw a massive pickup of other Chinese companies coming into the market now. Because NVIDIA's reference design, you can literally just copy and paste. You don't need to do anything. They do everything for you. The board designs, what components you need to use. So the R&D cost almost to those companies are zero. Because all you do is just copy and paste from what NVIDIA gives you. So then it's easy to do that. Then you can make all of these cheap cards that are fairly decent because it's NVIDIA reference design, slap a big ass cooler on it and package it and ship it. So now, then I think that further eroded EVGA, and again, that will erode Gigabyte, Asus, and MSI. Again, they have their own advantages and so forth. But because EVGA is more proud of like Kingpin Edition and all these high tier products that they sell, that starts to like eat at you, because it's like, okay, well, you've now made the decent reference design. How far can we push it? And then if we do push it, then the product becomes stupidly expensive. And then NVIDIA goes, yes, but you have to sell at this price. It's like, oh no, you can make a high tier product, but then it's like, how do you compete with that when you can't sell enough of those products? So then you start pushing out these enthusiast guys out of the market, because where do they go? And most of the market will buy in one area. So I think they just felt that pressure coming in, predicting where NVIDIA will eventually go. And NVIDIA, I think they'll probably do the same thing that Apple's done. I think there's a lot of things that NVIDIA's just copying what Apple's done successfully. Just own the channel. Once you own the channel, start making your own thing, and then they'll probably buy companies and just start like making their own cards and so forth, and try and focus that to the elite and so forth. Because again,
so you think they might go and buy an MSI or a Gigabyte?
I don't think they'll need to buy them. They can literally just internally. NVIDIA's smart. Jameson is not stupid. So the dude will probably know about beforehand and say, sweet, how do we move from this? Because they're already being fairly successful with the Founder Editions and the normal cards that they sell to Best Buy. There's nothing stopping NVIDIA from pushing that even further. And saying, sweet, guys, we'll start selling that directly to Amazon and so forth. So I think there's where the problem comes in.
It's going to be very interesting to watch, and this is some very interesting stuff coming down the
line. So we still haven't seen the full effects yet and so forth. This is very fresh now. So we'll see how everybody reacts and all that jazz in the coming weeks.
And there's a big keynote happening in Taiwan on Wednesday, which will be out long after this episode is released. So we're not going to even speculate on what might be coming, except that we know it's the RTX 4000 series.
Yeah, well, they've announced it. That's coming on the 20th of September. Yeah, we've seen all the cards. You can Google it, and you've seen the cards. They're going to be huge. They're going to be power hungry.
Yeah. But it's going to be an interesting keynote. I think one of the more interesting keynotes we've seen from NVIDIA.
Yeah, it's going to be a bit more awkward now after this news.
Indeed, exactly. I wonder if it was deliberately timed 2 days ahead
That
of...
is possible. It might be that they're just trying to say, like, if you don't be surprised if we're not there. That's that type of thing. So I don't think they're going out here specifically to say, boo, NVIDIA's bad or something. They're just now... That's why I think it's more...
Well, they pointedly went out and said,
again, they
bad NVIDIA, we're doing this because of you.
Yeah, that's you forcing us to do this. So that's what they're doing. It's just being honest and saying, this is how they feel like they're doing. Because again, the CEO of EVJ is he's a nice dude. So he's being honest because it's his company, he owns it. So he does what he wants to do with the company. And if he feels like NVIDIA's kind of sabotaging them, then he has every right to go and say, make his objections, and then if NVIDIA feels that brand that's been supporting them for 20 odd years, screw you, that should tell other brands, be careful with NVIDIA. That's the lesson that we'll learn from this is don't be careful with NVIDIA, basically, is the lesson that everybody needs to learn from. Yeah.
Anyway, we could talk NVIDIA all through this show, but we're actually going to talk about Linux this week, which is interesting since our show is sponsored by, one of our sponsors of our show is Microsoft. But Microsoft isn't the anti-Linux company it used to be, and in fact, they have embraced Linux quite openly. The acquisition of GitHub shows that, and the fact that they've integrated Linux into Windows quite directly as well shows that. So I do need to mention that they are one of our sponsors, Microsoft, together with HP. Thanks, guys. We appreciate the sponsorship of the show. Now, we are going to talk about Linux, and I think that we should probably offer a little disclaimer up front. As you can see, you might be able to see on the camera, I'm not sure.
Yes.
I'm using a Mac, and Gerhard over here is using you actually can't see because he's running, what is this, an Asus VivoBook. So you may in fact be running Linux on there, but I suspect you're not.
It's Windows 11, purely because I need to help customers.
Sure.
So I would gladly, I plan to make this, have another SSD that I can slap in here, because this laptop only has one SSD slot on it. Then I can swap out NVMEs and so forth. But especially if a customer phones in saying, I've got this problem, then I can go
quickly. Yeah.
Then I can do it step by step while I see what to do and tell the customer what to do. So that's the only real reason for not doing it yet. So
the other disclaimer I feel I need to offer is that while I have used Linux on and off for many, many, many years, I've only ever really toyed at the edges of it. I'm not an expert. No. I am not comfortable on the Linux command line. Although I know some of the basics of it, I'm not comfortable on the command line. When neither of us is a day-to-day Linux user.
No, not a fundy.
So I think it was important that we just preface this, because there are going to be hardcore Linux users watching the show. Please don't laugh at us too much if we make mistakes. We are amateurs when it comes to Linux, but we are going to be providing a view, a sort of a non-Linux user's view of Linux, if you like.
We are coming from a completely different point of view.
Exactly. But we're not going to trash Linux.
No, Linux has a lot of kudos for the Linux, and the different distros that people go in, and the amount of support they do in the back end is just amazing.
And I think it's fair to say, as a starting point for this discussion, that even though Linux has not won the desktop, it's won everything else. Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's one of those, how can you say, a side coup d'etat type of effect, where it won by actually not playing the game, but actually playing a completely different game.
Yes. So data center, the cloud runs Linux. Your phone runs Linux if it's running Android. There are your connected toaster runs Linux. Everything runs Linux.
Whether it's your routers, all those things, any embedded device, most of them all run some kind of Linux and so forth. Yeah. For good reasons, because there's a good support with it, good amount of. That's the advantage with open source developers that are hardcore. Especially then you get people like Linus, the other Linus, that can go in, that are geniuses. They are superb programmers, and they will optimize the crap out of it. Even now, I tell people, most PCs, if you're doing dev work and so forth, Linux is the way to go. On dev work, Linux just beats any operating system. I think Mac comes probably close. I probably would say Microsoft's in the third position. Yeah. The fact that they've now incorporated a lot of Linux subsystems into Windows 11 does give them a way out of that, where the people can have that dev work. But like even most of my Threadripper machines and so forth built in, you'll always see Linux has always done better with multi-core allocation and scheduling versus Windows.
And Microsoft's admitted this. I mean, it knows that developers want to use Linux.
Yeah, but
and that's why there's the Windows subsystem for Linux.
Yes, exactly. I think it's succumb to that, saying, okay, no, well, do a way you can say succumb, but it's also just being like, oh yeah, this is actually quite obvious. Just do what's the right thing, not try and fight it. If you try and fight it too much and so forth, then you can get to a position where Windows was in the old days, where they try and fight, and it's like, what's the point? You fighting it's like a river that's coming towards you and you're trying to fight the river. You're going to get flushed away because you can't beat the river back.
Yeah.
The river is so strong and so forth, and the momentum with it carried, it just completely bulldozed everyone.
Yeah.
So
Steve Ballmer stood in that dry river watching the flood coming towards him, and he put up a big middle finger and said,
a valiant
"Go away."
and then yeah, no, he kind of, again, Windows is still, kudos to Windows for where it is, because it is still dominated in like the OEM market and so forth. And especially in the older days, I think the benefit for Windows was mainly Microsoft, and again, credit to like Bill Gates and all those things, where they actually went to printer manufacturers. They actually sent people and software developers to hardware vendors to get the stuff done. So in the older days, it was not as easy as now. Just plug a printer in and Linux would work with a printer. Hell no. In the old days, that was a massive screw up to get that done. Whereas Windows, you could plug it in. Yes, you had your issues with software now and then, but at least you could print. And you could use fax, and you could do all of these things, and it worked with multiple hardware vendors and all those things. And again, DirectX also came in to help as well.
Yes.
Because OpenGL was the dominant, and technically in certain aspects we're still better, yes, but DirectX did make it way easier for developers and game developers to make games and so forth.
So why did Linux never really take off on the desktop? Was it because of drivers?
I think it's partly to do with the whole ecosystem that Windows actually gave. Because again, the two...
It was easy to use. You didn't have to fight to get a driver to work.
You had two fronts there. You had Apple coming in with their Apple OS and so forth. And again, even that still had a lot of issues with printers and all that jazz. So that's why Windows was the business. That's why I think that's where Windows actually, Bill Gates stride his best move there, is to get big government and big businesses all on Windows. Because as soon as all of those people use Windows and use Office, they want to buy a machine. If they go from their office and they go home, they want to use the same operating system because they've used it. So that was the actual move that a lot of people don't think about, but actually plays a lot into it. If you can get all those corporate people, again, if you imagine government, how much people government employs, like the American governments or European governments and so forth, that's a couple of 100,000 people that you employ. And if they're all using Microsoft, they're all going to want a Microsoft again, because that's what they know how to use.
And IT administrators and guys making the buying decisions didn't want something that was very difficult to support. They needed something
because the problem is they don't want to go and run and help the guy every time. How do I print? How do I copy and paste? How do I do this? Stupid stuff. I tell people it always comes down to the fundamental stuff. How to open a file, how to edit a file. Can you do that? Copy and paste. It's that basic stuff that Windows introduced and made accelerated better.
Whereas Apple was arguably going after the consumer market at the time, not the business market.
And that's why they struggled a bit more. That's why Bill Gates' his actual foresight to see, no, push. Business. And even like Office. That's why Office is such a huge... Again, you can say the two Office applications that are still sorted through is Outlook and Excel. And again, kudos to Microsoft. Excel is still the best out of all the Excels.
Excel runs the world.
Yes, now that was the backbone of many banks and many businesses and everything.
They might be running SAP or Oracle, but Excel is still...
And there's still probably people running Excel stuff in the background still today. And again, Excel is way more advanced than... I've had spoken to people that work in the bank industry and all those things, and they all will say Microsoft Excel is way superior than any other form of Excel.
I know, you speak to accountants and actuaries, they want to do something, they'll fire up an Excel spreadsheet. They won't go to SAP and try and do it.
But you can't even do that in like Google's equivalent or OpenOffice. Again, I'll give my kudos to OpenOffice, the what's the two there? It's OpenOffice and
LibreOffice.
LibreOffice and so forth.
There was a split, a fork of
fork and so forth. Both of those companies have become really good. I'll take my hat off, because we do get clients that come in and say, "Oh no, can't you pirate Windows for me?" It's like, no. It's like, dude, no.
People
we don't
still do that.
Oh yes, and it's like, no. But honestly, if you don't have the money, here's the open source version. If you're using Word and so forth, it's decent. And actually, funny enough, I would say probably like 95% of them will come back and say, "Oh yeah, okay, sure, thanks. That actually helped quite a lot. It's actually didn't have to pay for that because I didn't have the money." And it's a lot of students and then other people that literally don't have the money. They just like they can either use the free version of Office on the web, but some of them don't even have internet access. So the best alternative is that. And I must say the UI looks very similar to Windows and to Office and so forth, but it does make that easier. So the fact that the open source community is also up their game, I'm actually quite. I'll give kudos to them to that.
I do find though, and I'm going to criticize those platforms. I'm sure they're very good, and I don't use them extensively, so I can't really comment. But when I do install them and fiddle around with them on Linux, I do find they look very 1998 still.
Yes, there is some of the looks. You can now change it with, I think it's with LibreOffice, where you can make it more
modern.
More modern, but it's very similar.
It looks dated.
Like, no. Like they've got a new version that you can install.
Oh, it looks like Office now.
It looks
the ribbon and everything.
Very similar. Like I'm actually quite amazed Microsoft hasn't sued them yet.
Right.
That's how similar it is.
Okay.
So that's why I tell people, it's like, especially from last year, they implemented this where it's an optional thing that you can enable as you install it and so forth.
To see if Microsoft will sue us, let's make it optional.
And again, please, Microsoft, don't sue them. There's a reason why they exist. And again, your Word isn't really that important. And again, Google's pretty much dominated that. So if you need Word, just use Google and there you go.
Google Docs is free too, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think Excel and Outlook is the two still steadfast for Microsoft's Office suite.
And something that bears mentioning here is that, as we move towards software as a service and cloud-based apps, you can run Microsoft Office on Linux quite easily in a web browser.
Yes.
I'm not sure if Excel on the web is as powerful as it is on the desktop. I suspect not. But you can access Word, you can access Outlook, you can access all these apps as web apps now. Yeah. So all you need is a web browser, and Linux comes with a web browser. So
yes, you can use it there. So that's where where Microsoft is going. Microsoft is going fully subscription model. You can see that with Xbox, very subscription based. We already see that with Office 365, which is subscription based as well. And then you get all your online features, and then you get the storage for free. And then I think they're gonna do that big push with Microsoft 365 with businesses as well. I think that is. We've already seen Amazon and they data center not being happy with what Microsoft is doing, and other companies also not being happy because they basically circumventing all of these people that would normally go to a server company and say, or to a hosting company, say, host our server, and then we'll have so many clients, and then it's all virtual machines and so forth. Microsoft is now coming in, demolishing all of that and saying, we'll provide it internally, and then you pay one service and you get Office and the Windows for free. So I'm actually quite impressed how Microsoft has done this.
Yeah, but it's become so much easier for Linux users to access these services, not just Microsoft, Google as well. I suspect a lot of Linux users use the Gmail or the Google Google Workplace or Workspace suite of applications, which are all web-based anyway. It's always been Google's approach.
Well, Google's done that purely because they don't want to pay the Google or Microsoft tax on Office suite.
Why is that?
Well, imagine you Google. How many people do you employ? Google.
As Google itself?
Google itself.
Probably 100,000 people or more.
Exactly. So now, if you can say, no, we don't want to pay the Microsoft fee the whole time for Word and Excel and PowerPoint and all that jazz, we'll make our own Office. Way cheaper. So that's Google comes in for the ulterior motive in terms of saving the internal costs for the business. They're just funding it outside for anyone else to use because
in effect it's become the biggest competitor to Microsoft
exactly
Office
because it's out of necessity for themselves to save themselves money. That's the only reason why they did this, is to save themselves money. They didn't do that out of the good of the heart or trying to compete with Microsoft.
It's a business now.
It's a business now, but I thought it came from. We don't want to spend, because I can imagine how many governments, they spend in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year for all the licensing for Office and all that jazz. So if Google can save all that money, you can insert company here, Amazon, all of those companies. That's why you saw more and more companies move to the Google way, because it was substantially cheaper.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I think because Google got also easier with using mail in that. So I see now what you're saying there. Okay, so we'll get to that. So Google did that.
I'm literally adding that as a talking point.
Yes, talking point. Yeah, no,
not to
that's
try
what
and change the discussion
I'm thinking, I was like, yeah, no, that's a good point. So Google's biggest problem still as well is Gmail. I still get certain customers that don't really like Gmail's interface.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because most of those people are very, again, Outlook. You get all these people that get used to business and Outlook, and they all use Outlook, and that's what they prefer to use. Now, Google still has a problem with mail. And I think internally they've got probably better things that they use and so forth for mail sorting and so forth. Google Mail has improved the UI and so forth. But I would say I'm busy playing with Thunderbird. Thunderbird is getting decent now with their...
That's a very old client. That's a Mozilla developed.
Yeah, but they've updated the new one. The new one is you
good?
can have black theme and all that type of jazz in it. It's actually getting pretty decent. It's still not as good as Outlook.
Yeah.
So I would say, as I said, the two major ones are Outlook and Excel that need to be beat still.
Yeah. Yeah.
They still...
Mail clients on Linux, I find, have always been a bit poor. There was Evolution, which used to be quite good back in the day. I don't know if it's progressed a lot.
I think I've watched a couple of YouTube guys, and I know there's been significant improvements in those areas. As I said, we've played and we've installed a couple of people with Thunderbird now, since last year and this year, and I could really see we've got a lot of people saying coming back. It's like actually staying on Thunderbird, and like, no, I like this. This is pretty
for
decent.
An IMAP client, it was always quite good, POP3 or
Yes.
IMAP. But has there ever really? I don't think there's ever really been a good mail client on Linux that's connected to Exchange server, which is the dominant mail
ones.
server
I
in
think
business.
there is a couple that came up and so forth. I think the main problem with them is just the UI. So you can get versions that work and so forth. The problem was also the UI. Just
Clunky.
It's a bit more clunky, and the advantages with Microsoft is they learned that very earlier. So again, it's advantage for Microsoft there because they spent a lot of money in there. Again, the open source guys don't really have that money. I hope they get more money and get funding, especially like Thunderbird and so forth, so that we can start seeing a good competitor. I wish like Amazon and Google would actually step up the game there. They are both, especially Google, they are a software company. They should really
They're a web
innovate.
company, though. They never develop native apps for operating systems.
Oh, that's like they've done Word, they've done Excel. They can do that. I think Google has enough money and people that's smart enough, if they can get a group of like 25 guys and say, sweet, for 2 years, reshits the crap out of this. They've got good designers there at Google. It's not as if they don't have good designers, because that's what you need to look is how do people
why would they
use
do it though? I mean, they're a web company. Their interest is getting you onto a web platform.
But the problem is it's to use your product better. It's to use Gmail, because I get a lot of customer complaints where they don't like Gmail. They hate Gmail, and they'll pay Microsoft money to use Outlook, to not use Gmail. They'll use the mail address, but the backbone, but they won't use the client. So if Google can go and say later on, okay, pay us $10 a year, they'll get people that take that. Then if it's equivalent to Outlook, because Outlook, the only way you get Outlook is you either pay for it separately, which is I think 2,000 or something rands if you want to buy it outright, but then you only get support for 10 years or something like that, or you buy Office 365 and then you get everything. So I would say, like Google, like make a competitor. Again, you could say, oh, they want to spend the money on something. Again, that's their prerogative. But if I was there in a position saying that's what I would experiment in and say, look at this and see, do something interesting at least. You Google, you can do it.
Talking about big companies with lots of money, something that's fascinated me is why companies like HP, our sponsor, Dell, any major
OEM,
Lenovo, any OEM, why have they not spent R&D money developing an open source or a version of Linux, so Dell Linux, for example, or HP Linux, and shipping that product? They haven't put that money, that effort in. Some of the OEMs have shipped with Linux, so Dell. When you buy a PC, you can ship it with Ubuntu, but they haven't really put the energy into that. Is that because consumers don't want it, or? I
think it's from Dell. The OEM partners, their problem with them is they're good with the hardware, terrible with the software, and you can only look at printers.
These are not software companies,
Yeah, that's their main problem. So if Microsoft can come here and say, here's a solution, and we'll do the work for you. You don't have to spend money on it or R&D. We'll go to Intel, we'll go to AMD, we'll do the optimization. We'll go speak to the motherboard vendors that make the motherboards, get the chipsets right. We'll go talk to the USB foundation and get the USB drivers done and all installation. That's one area where we need to take our hats off to Microsoft. It's because they spend a stupendous amount of money to get drivers to work. And that's unfortunately where people, you can blame Microsoft as much as you can, but at some point we need to criticize the companies that make the hardware as well. Because Microsoft makes the OS, not the hardware. So a lot of printers...
Well, except for the Surface line, of course.
Well, they make their own, but it's more unique
niche
type of items.
Sure.
Because the problem is like printers and even mices and so forth. It would be unfair because a lot of people blame Microsoft when the printer doesn't work. Which is like, well, Microsoft didn't make the printer. Someone else did. And it's their job to make sure it actually works. Now, I've had this with especially all printer drivers. It's better to use, literally Microsoft has spent stupid amount of money to make printer drivers actually work. Which they had to pay out of their own pocket. They do not sell printers, so that's a complete net loss for them. They just purely did it because they had so many people phone them for problems that's not their problem to solve actually. And then they solve other people's problem out of their own pocket, which is weird for a company to do. Most companies don't do that.
It is in their interest to do it, to have their operating system work across.
But the problem is like most other companies would say, like Apple, if the dongle doesn't plug in working, it's the dongle's company's problem. It's not Apple's problem. You see how Apple handles that and how Microsoft handles it. Microsoft goes, oh, okay, sweet, let's see how we can work it. Apple just goes and says, no, it's the customer's problem. It's their problem. It's not our problem. You see how different company mentalities work there. And I think that also helped with... That's why I think Apple never could get a proper OEM working, because I know initially, probably in the early days, I think they would have wanted to sell Apple as an OS and then OEM vendors can install it. But I think that head clash already happened that early on, where Jobs wanted to do it in a certain way, and that's a way. And Microsoft, and he looked at it like, Bill Gates then started to be a bit more nicer. And he looked at it like, sweet, let's do this, spend money in the right areas. And well, that's all I can say in that regard, because even when you look at graphics cards and so forth, it was way easier to use a Windows PC with graphics card drivers and all that jazz. The other stuff sucked.
In hindsight, Bill Gates was right. I mean, he got 90% of the market.
Yeah, and that's purely by owning businesses. And he played that genius move. It's like, and that's one thing that where most people actually don't think about it. It's like, no, it's businesses. That's what he won, and that's their main focus still today.
So coming back to the OEMs, the reason we think that they don't offer their own, haven't developed their own Linux is because it's not their competency. Yeah,
it's not their skill set, and they don't benefit as much from it.
It's very difficult to do.
I think that is about to change. We see that now with Valve coming in with their own Steam Deck. We see it with some of the Chinese companies as well with their own gaming console, portable consoles in units.
Okay, so for niche specific things.
Pre-built machines that only do one function. There we go. So this is like your Nintendo Switch and all that type of stuff. But I foresee more of that happening in the years coming, because Linux is becoming so big and more people are getting into it, and there's more developers for it and so forth. I think you'll see certain OEM vendors start to play with it more in the back end now, but maybe in a couple of years we'll see it. That's why it's also a big hurry up moment for Microsoft. That's why we see Microsoft moving to this now new stage of having more Windowses every 3 years and so forth to try and circumvent that type of thing. The key thing is for Windows is they'll have to start making different models, making a low-powered edition and then a high-powered version. So, and then having some, like Mac is now advanced. Mac is now the geniuses with that, having OS on their phone and the OS on their laptop, and that is technically two different OSs, but they are very similar. So Microsoft desperately needs to learn from that and actually copy that. And then you're going to get your companies, again, Valve has their own ulterior motives not to use Windows and so forth, because the storefront and all those things. Microsoft has their own alternative motives. They want people to use the storefront so they can make money from that storefront. Again, Microsoft has now changed how they do the storefront and margins and so forth that they take from there.
And Microsoft, it should be said, is embracing Android to some extent, in that you can now run some Android apps on Windows. Yeah.
So I think there's going to become, you'll see more and more chip manufacturers as well having easier, like Intel and AMD will eventually have accelerators for those apps. Because the problem is going from ARM to x86 is a bit of a, you'll have, again, kudos to Apple, Rosetta, amazing piece of software.
Amazing.
Even though it's a bit broken sometimes when depending on the app, but holy crap, that's quite impressive that they've
Well,
engineered that.
It was able to run the Creative Cloud suite.
Yes.
Designed for Intel.
Yeah, well, designed for x86 and without crashing instantly. Because Adobe has its own problems. So that's where I think we will see it flow through. And that's why I'm like, I would want to see Microsoft push. That's why it's kind of sad for Microsoft when they lost the phone thing, because their Windows Phone was actually not bad.
I actually quite liked it.
Yes, a lot of people say that to me as well. And it's like, it was just poorly timed. It's one of those things.
It was 3 years too late.
Yes, and it's like
Android had already won.
Yes, that's a problem. So it's like you could have done this if you did it better. If you did, because they did do it earlier, and then they got screwed because nobody bought it.
Yeah.
And then they when they do it, they're too late, and it's like, oh,
yeah,
okay, that sucks.
And then Nokia, of course, threatened to go Android, and Microsoft bought Nokia.
Yes, so well,
one of the worst acquisitions of all time.
Microsoft does have a Microsoft money, so you can always just buy yourself out of a problem if you think that will solve it. And that
it did not solve anything.
that was a
worst acquisition.
Tank.
One of the worst acquisitions in history.
No, it was. It depends. If they had proper management, I think it would have turned around. But the problem is management wasn't there.
I think it was too late.
That's. I would have preferred them to have someone with Nokia, because it would have given more experience with phones and phone making and so forth. But again, I think at that point it was a bit too late, because Microsoft could just internally hire people and do that themselves and so forth. But Nokia does have.
Who was that Microsoft guy they sent over to Nokia to run the business for them? I've forgotten his name now.
Good question.
He was in the news a lot at the time. In fact, I had an interview with him when he was running Nokia. The name has slipped my mind. I'll Google it just now.
Google.
But he was famous for saying, for a speech where he said, we are on a burning platform and we need to get off this platform and find a new platform. So he said, Nokia is jumping into the cold sea. We need to find a new platform because this one is burning to the ground.
Yeah.
What happened was they jumped in the sea and they drowned.
Yeah. That's,
that was it. Game over. I'm going to find this guy's name now.
It's one of those like typical risky, old school Bill Gates, 1 shot million, see if it works, see if it don't. And it sank. So
Stephen Elop.
Yeah. Okay, well, again, a valiant attempt.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, most people, if you did proper research, you would have seen the writing on the wall saying, Microsoft, if you went into it full board, like proper, like as you would have went for Xbox, if they took what they did with Xbox and did that with phones, it would have been successful.
Yeah.
But they half-assed it a bit.
What happened at the time, I think, was Bulma was this was the rise of mobile. The iPhone had come out, Android was taking off, and Microsoft was getting left behind in mobile. Yeah. And it was panic stations. They had to do something.
Yes.
So, what's out there? Nokia, they're running our operating system. We need to buy them.
Yes. No.
And it was absolutely the wrong thing.
Out of desperation, you can say one sense. In the other sense, I think internally they had probably a lot of arguments saying, why buy mobile when we focused on PC? It's like it's one of those problems where it's like you're breaking yourself into many.
They thought that mobile was going to kill PC at that stage. It was so predominant. Everyone was talking about it.
I think the media overhyped it. So I think there's people internally in Microsoft that's smart enough that said this is not a threat. It's in terms of what they failed to see was this marketplace. I think that was the problem with Microsoft is they saw the hardware. They didn't look at what Apple looked at and said
App Store.
App Store. That's the money maker.
Yeah.
It's not the phone.
Jobs saw that right away.
That's the App Store. Yeah. That's how can we control where people buy stuff? Because if we can take that and exploit that, because the problem is Microsoft is coming from point of view of not the store. So that's not even on their mind, because they just go OEM, hardware,
software,
and then the customer.
Operating system. They were thinking operating system.
The customer buys the thing, and then they install the software, and we need to allow all vendors to install on our machine no matter what. Whereas Apple went, no, we're going to force them to go through our channel. And we're going to force the customer to buy from us. And that's how we can control, death grip that market. So again, smart from that side. And then you can say from Microsoft side, they would of course make that mistake because they don't have that mentality to go.
They're coming from the PC world,
Exactly. So that's why that's why you sometimes need to buy other companies that come with different mentalities and give them voices to speak in the company. I think that's what Ballmer failed to do. Ballmer bought them and failed to incorporate and actually listen. So he was a bit too arrogant because I wouldn't. I would say there was probably a division of Microsoft that said, no, the mobile thing's not really going to kick off or anything like that. Yes, it's going to be big, but it's not going to be profit. What's the profit margin on phones and all that jazz? It's like terrible. And then you have to go make an OS for it and do what? The guys still going to use Office on their laptop, which most people still do Office on their laptop. That's the problem. That's where Microsoft is focusing from, is where do people use our software? And I think that's what also helped the demise for Microsoft is they could never get the bigger picture and say the store. And that's the caveat.
In the end, I'm sure Microsoft would have loved to control mobile, but at the end of the day, it doesn't actually matter.
If they learned from the store earlier on and actually pushed the store on desktop as well, imagine how much money Microsoft would have made already.
That'd be a $5 trillion.
Oh, no, they would have killed Apple and everyone. That's like even Google would look at them at amazement if Microsoft did that.
Yeah.
Where they can own imagine the marketplace if Microsoft did that in the 90s or the early 2000s, where you had to buy everything through Microsoft. But the only thing that you can argue is in the old days, the old guys would not allow that. They would have beaten Microsoft to a pulp. And there would have been an antitrust case. And the fact that Apple could get away with it and not Microsoft also tells you something.
Because they were so small at the time. Well, Apple's a big company now, but back then they weren't that big.
They were also pretty big then. The problem is it's like...
Compared to Microsoft,
but the problem
is
even if you're small, you can argue it's like if the people that bought their hardware kind of just went, oh, okay, I'll just allow it. But if Microsoft... There is double standards. Certain companies, I tell people, unfortunately... Certain companies can get away with other things that other companies can't.
Microsoft would never have been able to build a closed garden app store.
No. That's
it would have been nailed by the US Justice Department and the EU and everyone else.
And then Apple can get away with it. So it's tell people even if the two companies do this exactly the same thing, one company will be praised for it and the other company will be demised for it. Yeah. So that's why I tell people it's like, unfortunately, that bias is always going to happen with certain companies, and you will just have to accept it.
So let's come back to Linux. So Microsoft hated Linux. In fact, it even more intensely hated the GPL, which was the license that Richard Stallman came up with to govern open source software, including large parts of Linux, with Borma describing it as a cancer that attaches itself to, I can't remember his exact words, but it was not flattering.
Well,
now, just 15 years later or so, Microsoft loves Linux.
Well,
they profess to anyway.
It's more of acceptance. It's smart for if you've got people in high positions that accept certain things to be true now. You can only fight through so long before it becomes the actual accepted saying, okay, guys, this is now how it actually works. So I think in the earlier days for Windows, as Windows was still in a fear mode of if the OEM vendors completely switched to Mac, we screwed because they would have been screwed. If Dell, HP, Lenovo, and all these guys dropped
to Linux, you mean?
Yeah, if they swap to Linux, then it means because again, all the government orders for government or business orders and so forth are for Dell and HP.
Yeah.
So if they lose that business, so I think that was that like overzealousness with this, like
this is threatening our core business. Windows is our core business. Protect Windows at all costs.
That's why you kind of hype that up so that business people also say, oh no, Linux is bad and evil. You see that how you swift the actual perception,
uncertainty and doubt
into that market from well-established person saying, oh, this thing is bad and evil and you shouldn't use it because blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter why you don't like it. I'm just saying it's bad. So if Steve Ballmer says it's bad and all the other CEOs also go, oh, okay, we should be careful. You see, so it's just more enticing fear into it.
Yeah.
But
that was the strategy, absolutely.
I do understand where he can sometimes, from some of his viewpoints are valid. Some of them are completely bull crap, but some of them are valid because the problem is having something open source means you can have bad actors doing stuff. That is always a possibility.
Although an open source advocate will immediately argue, but you can inspect the code and you can see if there's a...
But now, that's now, the problem is if you're as big as that. So we can look at certain issues where Linux had some big issues with exploitation with viruses, where they got completely sidetracked with. Where, like, if you had a Linux machine, the thing infected your machine, you're dead. So that was his fear against it. Doesn't mean it justified, or nor do I justify what Palmer said and so forth. But that's like we need to look at his concerns and their viewpoint. That's a point, but it means it can be negated. Same as Windows. You can say Windows is also bad because it does all this proprietary stuff.
No, he was doing this to protect Windows. That's what this was about.
Exactly. Yeah. But some of his points do have merit. But
now that they've moved to cloud has become their big business.
Yes.
they don't have to protect the operating system anymore. The operating system doesn't matter as much to Microsoft as it once did.
I think it still does now.
It still matters, but not as much as it did.
Well, I would say it matters more to them now.
Windows matters more to them now.
Yes.
Okay.
That's why they went to the 3-year cadence. They kind of gave up on Windows a bit because
they did.
That's why you could see Windows 10.
Windows 10 was getting sad.
Windows 7 was there. Once they got Windows 7, they've got Windows 7. Then they tried Windows 8 and that failed.
That was a disaster.
8.1 was decent. It was more touch. Again, before its time, it was meant for somehow making an OS that's between touch and
they were
trying
to copy Apple. Yeah.
It's not copy Apple, but it's trying to, how do you make, because most of the engineering samples that even Intel had were all flipbooks like this, where you could flip the screen and make it touch and so forth.
This was the time of the iPad. They were trying to respond to the iPad.
It's not, again, I tell people, Apple has a tendency where people reward them for things that they didn't innovate. Touch was before that. So I think Windows tried to say, we need to start using more touch devices because the younger generation is starting to use touch devices.
Touch, yeah, exactly.
I already see this already where people literally they would prefer a touch screen laptop than a non-touch one because they're more comfortable using touch.
Interesting.
Than a keyboard and mouse. That age is coming. And especially with the newer kids, like literally if you give them, they struggle to sometimes use keyboards and stuff. They can use a phone very easily. So literally I tell people, it's like, here's my laptop, and I flip it, and they go, touch, and they're way more productive. All of a sudden.
Wow.
So I tell people,
I am the exact opposite.
So now the problem that Apple with Microsoft had with 8.1 was again education, because I think it was a lot of the old people kind of literally hated Windows 8 purely because they tried something new.
Yeah.
Which that was a terrible thing, because Windows learned a bad thing there. Don't experiment. And
it was too radical.
And again, customers started to blame for that.
It was far too radical.
The problem is there should have been measured saying, sweet. The problem is there was so much outrage, unnecessary outrage in my opinion, where people just hate it. And I literally I've had people when I installed machines 8.1 and so forth, and like people complain, I can't use the operating system. Okay, what do you need to do? Okay, I want to open control panel.
People panic.
Then they're like, okay, press the Windows key, type in control panel. Oh, there it is. Yes, it's still there. They didn't remove it. Have you actually tried to learn how to use the operating system? Maybe it's more effective using it like this. Oh, yeah, it's actually better. And then people realize, oh, I'm just fighting because it's not the way I'm used to. And I'm unwilling to learn something new.
People don't like change. I mean, there's a lot of hate towards Windows 11.
People like change because if Apple does it, it's fine. If Apple changes your phone and so forth, everybody goes, woo, creative, woo, how creative it is. But if someone else does it, oh no, you're changing it, they're stamping the feet.
But you have to look at the Windows install base too. I mean, your average Windows user looks for a start button, clicks it.
That's what I tell people. That was Windows' failure there, was education. They did something and not actually thinking through, hey, we need to actually prepare people for this shift. Because we have all segments that we cover.
Yeah.
So we need to introduce it quite slowly into the market. Not this like, we're going to do new OS. If you don't like it, you don't like it. That attitude is a very bad attitude from Microsoft. They did that. So I think hopefully they learned those lessons and so forth. I think that's what they've learned now with Windows 11. That's why Windows 11 is very similar to Windows 10.
Well, actually, the start menu is radically different in Windows 11.
That's just it. But there's a lot of similarities. They haven't completely changed it.
Yeah, you'll be comfortable if you're coming from Windows 10.
So if you come from Windows 10, you can still use Windows 11 without real major problems.
Yeah.
So I tell people, I think they've learned now to say, move the goalposts a bit slowly and so forth. Apple can get away with this. We can't get away with this drastic changes if we want to do drastic changes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting times for Microsoft because now that they have that 3-year cadence, I think that hopefully they will speed up innovations and more different. Right. Going to Linux way, making more distros.
Yeah. I'm going to steer this conversation back to Linux because we are talking too much about Microsoft.
That's the advantage now with Linux is Linux has so many different iterations of distros that you can download and use. You can have ones for the creative guys, you've got ones for programmers, you've got ones for gamers, for like Pop OS and so forth that you can use that's more Windows-y like and so forth in certain aspects and so forth. So I think that's where Windows can learn from Linux is to actually make it so that the operating system is more adjustable. So that we can already see that with having with Windows 11, you can go through and you can have different desktops and all that jazz. But having a different mode where you can actually just change, like if you gaming and so forth, you want this version of Windows that's gaming orientated and focused on the workstation version. So I do appreciate
more customization is what you're saying.
Exactly. Bring it out and so forth, because Linux, again, that's the amazing part of Linux. If you don't like this disto, just uninstall and install a new disto, and there you go. Put it on your stick. You can trial it, run it from the stick, trial it a bit, see how it goes. If you like it, install it in your OS, and then you use it.
Yeah.
So Linux is more freedom.
Which distros have you used?
I've played with Mint and with Pop.
Okay.
So Mint, we've done a couple of customers and so forth, especially with the old laptops, because Mint does have a lot of...
Do you get customers actually ordering Linux on new laptops and computers?
Yeah, we do get... Jeremy does normally installations.
What do they normally want? Ubuntu or...?
Some of the guys do Ubuntu, not as much anymore. Ubuntu, kind of, I don't know what's happening there. People will have to inform me a bit more on the Linux, like, whole thing. There's a lot of hate against Ubuntu for some reason.
Is there?
I have no idea why. Again, there's probably valid reasons why. I presume it's the UI is not that nice and all that jazz. Yeah. It's that type of stuff.
Purple colors and stuff.
So we've had people ask for Pop OS. We've installed Mint and a lot of old laptops. We're talking circa 2014 laptops and 2009 laptops that people install
Which
Mint.
Is what Linux is great for, actually. Because you can get these really lightweight Linuxes which run on really old hardware.
No, so we do that for a couple of customers, and we've get a couple of dev customers that say, we want this specific disto, or we want Fedora installed on it, and so forth. Jeremy says, sweet, that's fine. What version of Fedora do you want? Because there's even iterations in that. Customer gives all the details, and he'll install it. And I must say, the brands that there's still now and then issues with like MSI, with certain Linux distros, especially the older motherboards. I would say the new ones we have had almost no issues with that. But I know we've had ASRock, we've had issues with Linux at some point with their boards. So that still happens now and then. We motherboard Windows with certain Linux distros, it just doesn't work for some reason. You try and install it, it just doesn't work. So unless it's something that we don't know how to do or something like that. I know AMD and Intel have been amazingly good at supporting Linux. Like, they support Linux better than Windows. Just kind of sad, but
because good engineers run Linux all day.
It's again open source, so the open source guys are like, it's easy to tweak and optimize and go to GitHub, which is ironically owned by Microsoft. Then you can optimize and tweak the code in there and all that jazz. So I presume that does help a lot.
I can guarantee you a large percentage of the engineers working at AMD and Intel run Linux as their primary.
Oh yes, no, a good portion of them.
Yeah.
So I think from what I can say is we do see customers more and more coming into it. I would say that AMD so far has given us the least amount of friction with installing, especially with the new ones. So since here from Zen 1, Zen 2, installing Linux on any AMD laptop is probably the easiest thing we've ever done. It just works. Whereas traditionally we've had issues with certain brand laptops where you try and install Linux on it, and it's just those sound doesn't work, or the USBs don't want to work for some reason because that driver that the USB needs just doesn't work, or the webcam doesn't work. Stupid stuff. So the chip supports it, but then the stuff that goes around it doesn't work. Or like the backlit keyboard won't work. And I was like, oh, that's frustrating. Now you can't use the hotkeys. They don't work. So it's stupid stuff that you don't necessarily think about, but then you can't really use it. And then I know certain laptops had issues with touchscreens as well. I think Linux needs to improve the touchscreen implementation.
This is where I've always found Linux to be a bit finicky, and is the reason I've never really used it as my primary OS. It's, a driver doesn't work, or some component of this laptop doesn't work 100%.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're now getting the hardware is getting more complex but simplified. Because like, especially with AMD laptops, the reason why it's so easy is because literally the only thing now, especially with the upcoming AMD chips, especially now with 5000 series, even more of that is literally like even the USB controller is built into the chip. So if AMD makes all the drivers available into Linux, everything will work. Literally the only thing that you'll have to then go make sure works is the hotkeys. That's it. In terms of screen and all those things, that's all run through AMD now. For Intel as well. Intel's also, most of that's all on their South Bridge. So I presume by doing that, by Intel and AMD doing that, it also makes Linux's job easier because then they don't have to go and support all of these weird niche USB devices and weird nuances or network controllers and all that jazz. So I think that Linux will actually have an easier time in the future actually supporting laptops than where it was previously, especially in old days where it was terrible. Yeah. Because you had like 20 different companies' software packages that you had to install just to get the thing working. Now, literally, if you with the AMD machine, you install it, you install the AMD chipset driver, and you basically 99% there. That's how easy it's become now for laptops.
But if you really understand Linux and very comfortable around the command line and know what you're doing, which I'm not.
Yes.
But I have friends who are absolutely, and they've been running Linux for 20 years.
Yeah.
And to look at their desktops and see what they've done is absolutely amazing. I look at this and I say, wow, that's so cool. I can't do that in Windows. I can't do that in Mac. How did you do that? That's amazing. So the customizability, if you understand how to use the OS, which most people don't, is amazing.
Yeah, no. So for devs, that's what we will. It's like the underneath bits are amazing. Only problem with it is it can also catastrophically fail.
Yes.
That's why you have to be a dev to fix your own screw ups that you make or something like that. So that's.
But if you're comfortable in that environment,
no, it's again from complexity comes simplicity. If you know all the complexity, it becomes very simple for you. So the only thing that I can really attest to is we have actually a blind customer, and he sets up his Linux PC to be fully accessible for him, and he even we were amazed how he uses his PC. A blind guy. Everything through voice. But he uses his PC faster than most of my able users.
And that's amazing.
And
he's completely blind.
He's completely blind.
Wow.
He's completely blind.
So does his PC talk to him? How does it work?
Yes. He like literally he has text to speech.
Text to speech.
But he's like everything's in the head.
Yeah.
So he just shouts and the PC just goes and does this.
Okay.
And he works in terminal.
Amazing.
He literally as blind person and he talks in terminal and opens this document and reads the document from in terminal. He does everything in terminal.
We should get him on the show at some point.
So it's like, holy smokes, my dude, that is impressive as hell.
Yeah, we must get him on the show in a future episode.
So that's why I talk to people. I'm quite happy with Microsoft is also pushing accessibility quite aggressively. Especially within Office. You can actually see this in a greater thing for Microsoft, accessibility. This is one of the big problems I think Linux will have, is the advantage with Microsoft having that big money, they can spend big money in accessibility for people. You can see that with Xbox as well, with using pedals and all that jazz, and then having controllers and then text-to-speech. Office, you'll see, funny how many accessibility features built into Windows now. Brightness control, contrast control, all that type of stuff. And I'll speaking up here in ignorance, I do not know if Linux will have those features and so forth. So high contrast, making it easier. Because I do have people I've got, I think it's 2 customers that have AMD, the actual medical disorder, where their eyes are deteriorating. And so you have to literally, her screen is 400 times zoom. And bright, like a massive bright. And then we did the contrasting. And when we did the contrasting for her, she said, I can actually now use my PC easily.
Amazing.
And so I thought Microsoft has, I would hope there's some funding or a company that can go. I would hope Valve or something like that, because Valve would have need for that accessibility features in their devices if they want to push that, which will then the whole Linux community will then benefit from someone pushing those accessibility features in Linux as well.
Before we wrap, I want to chat a bit about gaming on Linux. And again, I'm not the expert on this. I haven't even tried to run a game on Linux, but I believe it has gotten a lot better in recent
considerably
years.
better. It's actually amazing the amount of work Valve has done in this. I know there's been some massive updates that Valve has done and other actual open source developers improving, funny enough, AMD's own code using on Linux and so forth. So I think it is actually funny how this worked out for AMD. The fact that they worked with Steam to make that Steam thing in there, I think Intel is very envious, because this is giving AMD a massive leg up in Linux with gaming, because there's now a lot of programs that literally only work if you're funny enough, if you have a AMD graphics card and an AMD CPU, somehow it works better than if you had an Intel NVIDIA. NVIDIA's a bit rough with Linux. There's a bit, again, it's probably going to get better now, because NVIDIA, I think, sees us now that like, whoa, AMD's getting big in Linux. We need to like change how.
And Linus Torvalds was saying something positive about it.
Well, it's the software development and so forth. So I think, especially with the emulation stuff I've seen, is quite impressive how good they've become, where certain applications, if you run it on Steam OS with AMD hardware and all that jazz, it runs better than you would have run it natively in Windows. And that's kind of cool and sad in one way, where the emulation and then basically the trickery of the software is better than the running it natively in the actual operating system. So I think if they play more and more with that, that might be very interesting in the coming years if they can push that more and saying, sweet, if you want to play all your old machines, here's this virtualization of Microsoft that does a better job than Microsoft. So you don't have to install Windows 95 or something stupid like that. You just run it. And I think there's a big push. I hope Valve pushes the beast out of this, because this is amazing if they can get this right, especially for older games. And then it's going to be easier for older games to use the potential of newer games, because we've even seen the amazing stuff that they've done with the OS, where you can have like the upscaling tech is built into the actual operating system, so it actually can do it in real time in the operating system. You actually don't need to actually have a driver level thing. It actually happens in the OS level, which is also amazingly cool. So that's where advantage we can see with Linux, where it's like, holy crap, you can't do this in Windows. Like, Windows now has to catch up with what Linux is doing there, with especially with Valve pushing that type of tech. So I really hope that comes from there. So yes.
Lots of interesting stuff happening. After this discussion, I'm quite tempted to go and install Linux.
Oh yes, no, when the new AMD stuff comes out, and then as soon as they make easier accessible versions of the Steam OS, because Steam said they are going to make an official desktop version that will launch, but that's still coming because they're still testing their own. Again, this is probably going to take them 2 years, year to 2 years for them to actually get to a comfortable position. Now it's still testing. We're still in the testing phase, but it's probably not the last time we see Valve making hardware. It's going to be very interesting to see what the relationship between AMD and Valve is going to be, because I think there's going to be some cool stuff with VR with Valve coming, and then that will also probably be very Linux based, and then we can only hope that Valve will make a laptop, because I think that would be
game changer.
That would be massive. Ballers move. I think Microsoft would go, ooh, this is dangerous now. We are now in the danger zone.
Just don't call it a cancer.
No, it's not a cancer. It's just danger zone. It's like
right. I do hope that if you are a hardcore Linux user and you have watched this entire episode or listened to this entire episode of Everything PC, that we haven't tortured your soul too much, because we probably have.
We've probably offended some people, but. I'm ignorant. I'm stupid. I acknowledge my idiocy.
I run a Mac. I've got excuses.
It's like one day I'll learn.
But we'll keep tinkering.
Yes,
I like to play.
No. It's a lot of potential.
Before we go, our sponsors are HP and Microsoft. Thank you so much, guys, for sponsoring the show. We will be bringing you a special episode of Everything PC in the coming weeks, where we chat to senior executives from HP and Microsoft. Looking forward to that.
Yes, that will be very interesting.
Have them right here in the studio. We'll ask them lots of hard questions. No, we'll go easy on them. They're our sponsors. It'll be a good discussion, though.
Yes, we'll be interesting to see their point of views and where they want to see those companies going.
Absolutely. And next week, we're going to talk about Mac OS. I suspect that's going to be a fairly short episode, but
we'll you know me.
And then before we wrap this season of Everything PC, we are going to do an episode where we look at our ultimate tech, the tech we are lusting after. What do we really want to have? If price is no object, what are we going to buy? And I've got my eye on some stuff. It's running into the sort of 6-figure range.
Of course, no. Buy some couple of 4090 cards. And
Exactly. And you need one of those new... no, let me not give it away.
Yes, no. We'll come to it.
If you've got any feedback, drop us a line, info@techcentral.co.za. If you want to subscribe to Everything PC, just go to youtube.com/techcentral. That's our main feed. You can hit the subscribe button there. You'll get this show. You'll also get TC Daily, our new daily technology show, and the Impact series, all worth checking out. And if you prefer your tech in audio format, you can find us on all good podcasting platforms as well. All you need to do is go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, whatever your favorite poison is, and search Everything PC, 2 words, and you'll find us. From Gerhard, who works at Computers Only, and myself, the editor of Tech Central, Duncan McLeod. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.